Hello and welcome to another edition of Pchem Lab Screencast. I'm Jeff Yarger, and I want to spend a few minutes going through, at least in my class, Chemistry 343 at Arizona State University, which is a physical chemistry one-semester laboratory. What I use is a common rubric or format and or expectations for lab reports associated with this class, which is I really want lab reports to be in the style, format, content that you would find a normal scientific journal article from any American Chemical Society journal. And with emphasis placed in maybe a little different areas than some of the ACS journals, but overall I provide a fairly detailed explanation of where I want this. I don't want to go through this point by point except to say a few minor things. First, of course, a title, and typically I want this to include the experimenter number. The authorship is really just so I have your contact information, your name, any lab partners you had, your email address or cell phone numbers, but typically email address is good enough, so that I could contact you if needed. That's really what these top two are about. The abstract, the major thing in that is that you're giving the numerical values or basically the result that you collected and the associated errors with it. So it's really just to very quickly summarize the major results that you found from the laboratory. The introduction, which is different than most you would find at standard ACS, is that a lot of times introductions are fairly long, detailed background information, etc. The labs you're doing, the background information is found in numerous books, journal articles, etc. And there's no point in really regurgitating it. Really what I want you to do is just quickly summarize, the background material and relevant references that you use to understand the background material and the introductory material associated with this lab. Whether it's obviously going to include things like lab handouts, but it's going to include things like books written on these topics, journal article, review articles about these topics, etc., where you better understood the material. And it's really about giving your readership, a feeling for the references and a quick summary of what you use to understand the background material, both the instrumentation, the chemical techniques, the analysis techniques, the error techniques, etc., associated with the lab you did. And all of that first part, is given nominal points. Most of the points are given for the experimental and results and discussion sections of this. The experimental is because that's really what you did, whether it be the computational experiments or the laboratory experiments. Really the measure is, can I reproduce the experiments, whether it be computational or laboratory experiments that you performed? So can I reproduce using the same software, the same laboratory techniques, the same laboratory equipment, etc., chemicals? Could I reproduce what you did in the lab? And writing an experimental section is giving enough detail so that somebody else could do that. I think that's enough to say about that. The results in the discussion, really what I like to think of here is that figures, tables, and the associated figure caption and table captions can really be used to tell the story of a journal article, or in this case of a laboratory report. I should be able to flip to figure number 1 through figure number X and quickly get a feel for kind of what you did in that experiment. In other words, really storyboard your report based on figures. And that's how I often look at, when I look at journal articles, I don't usually start from the title and read it straight through to the conclusion. I usually kind of skip around and read a few things, but basically look at the figures, just like in a book you would look at the pictures to kind of get a sense for what it's about. So a lot of emphasis is placed in that, as well as being able to show detailed, how you did your calculations, your error analysis. But a lot of those detailed calculations can just be put in the supplemental section. So at the very end of your report, just have a separate supplemental section. And again, a lot of common journal articles now have supplemental information. Conclusion should, almost restate some of what's in your abstract, as well as give the results, the interpretation, the comparison to literature values, etc., that you might have had in your discussion. And then of course you should have lots of references, both scientific journal articles, books, handouts, web material, etc., that you use to really get a grasp of this material. And then I want to just quickly say, I'll put this up on the web, but I think of it as it's always good when you're writing a report to think of your own self or peer evaluation. When you read it, what are people going to comment on the various sections? Is your writing, clear and understandable? Does it have good grammar and spelling? Did you give enough background information and referencing to understand it? Is it clear? Is the clarity of the figures and the quality of the figures and tables, appropriate? Do you have appropriate error and data analysis and example calculations or full calculations of the results? And did you provide good referencing? And so you guys are going to do a lot of self and peer evaluations, as well as where the TAs and myself use this type of rubric for calculating. So I hope this gives you a general sense for writing a lab report, and I'm going to follow this up with a couple examples out of the literature, and I'll do that in a separate screencast.